So I worked on the civil service side, and I took this photo. So a typical thing that I spent 2.5 years doing. Actually, you sell public policy. I'll talk about that later. They do these secondments for staff or researchers to get firsthand experience. That's how I got involved, and then I stayed. And so I was a researcher inside the civil service and the Government Office for Science. Anyway. But so the Government Office for Science is a function of government that really focuses on getting academic research and science in its broadest interpretation into the work of policy design, delivery, and implementation. And so Jane and I have been working together over the past year to try and develop this really kind of light touch training on just the essentials. So there's a lot of step-by-step detail we could go through, but actually we believe that there's just sort of 3 constructs you need to know for you to craft your policy engagement in your way for what works for you. And so the first thing is this idea of touch points, because, so you were talking about a lot of them, right? Like being part of heritage assessment. I forgot the phrase. So there was the APPG. The gentleman at the back was saying, like, actually we get involved just as experts. Conservation management plans, you can host events, you can write blogs, you can be on social media. And so just step 1 is actually just thinking about touch points themselves, because it kind of starts to dispel this whole idea of engagement as the nebulous everything into a few concrete types of activity, but more specifically, where do they sit, right? Like I think what we really believe is that to situate them, to actually make sense of, for this particular policy that's going on, what are the particular touch points coming up? It's not going to be everything. It's only going to be a few things, and some are going to work better for you than others. And so we're definitely not showing up to be like, these are all the things you must do to engage with policy. We want to basically equip you. It's a bit utility focused, but we want to support you in making sense of how you could find your touch points that fit with the way that you work. So the first exercise that we have for that is to just start getting a little bit more familiar still with these touch points. So that's the bit that we do between now up until lunch, although we have a speaker to help frame this. So we're going to focus just on the policy journey that you saw and then the touch points. Just before we hand out our toys, what it looks like is we have, thanks Jenny, we have just summarized that journey in this way, a really, really simplistic way. And don't be mad with us for printing a few things. It was the small thing that we did. So it basically takes away the blue and just reminds you that there's this flow of like the general interest being generated and agenda setting to all the way of coming up with ideas of what government should be doing with public policy and its various guises and instruments and things it does, to then implementing and taking action. And then what we have, you will put this here. And so the first question we'll have is, this is a generic representation of what the process of policy making is about. It's not like project management. It's not like a fixed, everything is phased and staged, and then once one stage is done, once public debate is done, then we move into policy process. It's not as linear as that. So that's one part. And we have a question really for you, is that we would like to have you use a day to support your work already. So rather than impose a particular policy area on you, we can help you, so don't panic if nothing comes to mind. But before you start the exercise, step 1 is check in your tables. Is there either a project you're working on, one of you, or together, or something happening in the department that you would like to have the question about, and how does policy engagement for that project work? So is that clear? So just sort of start to like anchor it into something that is meaningful to you, in case it's helpful. Is there any questions about that first part? So in the group C, is there something that we feel we want to focus in on as either a UCL activity or an upcoming policy moment? It could be the United Nations anniversary and a particular piece about heritage and something like that. I don't know. Have that conversation. And then the second will be that we have for you the touch points. And it's like a game, but it's not. But it's fun. Where just start from the front. Someone can be the card holder. And so I just say, actually, when we think about a call for evidence, where for like the thing that we're looking at, where in the policy journey would that make for a good touch point? That make sense? And then the next one would be, okay, when it comes to like actually encouraging media story, whether working with a conversation or a journalist, where might we want to do that? And you work your way through the cards. Maybe some of the things that you were saying, like hosting your own event, is, I can tell you now, that's not in the cards. So you just either flip it and write it on, or we have some blanks included. And so the magic envelopes will be on your tables in a moment, and then we're going to do about 10, 15 moments of just that. And what we want is, this is not an exam, it's not a test. Learning outcome, please, at the end of the 15 minutes, if you don't feel like we've helped you to understand what these different types of phases involved in the policy design process, policy delivery process are about, or what specific touch points in the world of policy making are about, that's where we come in, and we are going to come around and talk to you. Just a few things that we'll sort of reflect on that we've been hearing that we think might be helpful to hear shared across the tables, and then by all means also share what you've been. So actually just the first question is, were any of the touch points you saw, would you like them to be explained in terms of what they would feel or actually look like in practice? Was there anything about just what you were looking at that didn't make sense, which is entirely fine, because they're also framed very generically? No? Well, we will just keep going more. Also, you touched on so many of them. We were mentally making our checklist when you were sharing and pooling your own touch points. The second would be, was there any disagreement for your particular pieces that you were focusing on in terms of which touch point you might use where? Did anything like that happen?
I felt that there was advisory committee, for example, which we found could fit into the whole process, basically. So we've kind of recycled that throughout the process.
And that, so, takeaway number one is it really helps to think about concrete touch points. We'll revisit in a moment for why. But two, there is no protocol for this, or no science, or whatever you want to call it. There is no definition of which one goes where. So there is no map. Did we? I don't think we even made one. There is none. There is no gospel in terms of what you should do when. And so maybe also kind of how we got started, our like slight irritation was that that's sometimes how it's represented. You know, like early on, do a petition. Then, you know, do a briefing. Then do a blog. No. You decide for your project what would work where. Now, what was really interesting about the conversation we were having is that, so we're only human, right? It's a bit morbid, right? We're only human. We have limited time. And when we say when we have limited time, as researchers, as people employed at academic institutions, we probably don't even have that much extra time to do policy engagement. So then, probably best if we know how to focus. Of all the things we could do, which one are we going to do? And so what could easily happen is that there's no disagreement, because what's the harm in doing more? Let's do a few briefings. Let's do multiple blogs. Let's do a bunch of events. What's the key word to come out of that? Burnout. Maybe there's that. And there's also, you know who's also human? Our policy partners. They don't have unlimited time. So they want to know. They don't want to know. They end up working closer with you and trusting you if have had empathy for who they are. And we're going to talk a lot more about that, about which touch point works for them. So, of course, there's nothing wrong here by getting multiple touch points all over the chart. The reality is for a particular project, if you map this out, you're only going to go for a few. And so it's just good to know of all the options available to you, and then to really have that thought about, I cannot do all of them. You know, I'm not going to write a blog every afternoon. And so then what really happens, which is what we're doing on the table over there, is what really helps you to focus is to actually think, if this goes successful, what will happen afterwards? What's the next touch point? Even if it's post my project. So sure, a project's been successful at creating a public interest in a particular heritage agenda, then what? And so in order to just sort of have a little bit of a think through of like, what are these next touch points ideally? And they will typically help inform whether you do a blog piece or whether you host an event. It's not like one is better than the other. It's about being clear on like what that journey could be for your project. Yeah. Okay, good. And so, not to pick on blog posts, but as an example, let's say I've decided that creating a story, doing like a really good piece of writing, and I'm going to put it out there on the UCL website, or maybe even in The Guardian. It's there for someone to find. And then usually they were like, that's engaging, we're not. Some people might go, that's engaging policy. Is it though? What do I need for that to be engaging with policy? I need somebody at the other end, right? I mean, it seems so obvious. But I think that there's a lot of pressure on, not saying our great institution here, but there is sort of a lot of this like pressure on researchers to be like, hey, for that third bucket of your academic promotion career framework, can you engage and can you demonstrate that there's a lot of online volume to do with your presence in these debates? That is not the same as having a touch point. That is like, there's value in that, but it's not the same as engagement. And so I think that you should be empowered. Jenny and I, that's like our passion, that we don't want to be there. Like, we want to support you in knowing which touch points you want and then come and give you additional advice on how to get the most out of a particular type of touch point. So that's the lesson of that. Step number one, whenever you do anything, think about, for this particular project or this thing I'm working on, like what's the journey and what are some of the possible touch points? Great. And maybe now is like the time to, unless there are more questions actually. Any questions at the moment? We're going to do a lot more with these. No? Maybe time to hear from,
Yeah.
yep.
Rosie.